My given name, Agnes Mayhew, was a whisper on official documents, a forgotten formality. To the majority, the vibrant, demanding circus that was my family, I was simply Grandma. It was a title they'd assigned, a label that felt less like an endearment and more like a function, a perpetually available source of comfort, wisdom, and, let's be honest, those legendary oatmeal cookies. The cinnamon-scented warmth of those cookies was, for decades, perhaps the only truly constant thing in their ever-changing, self-absorbed lives. For 75 years, my existence felt less like a life and more like a quiet, sprawling epic of unwavering service. I was a human scaffolding for their ambitions, a silent bank for their dreams. I poured my soul, my very essence, into the bedrock of this family, truly believing it was a structure built to stand forever. What they didn't know was that while they were busy building their lives on my foundation, I was quietly building something else entirely. Something they'd never see coming. A secret so profound, so utterly unexpected, that it would unravel their carefully constructed world in an instant. My house, a modest bungalow that hummed with half a century of my carefully curated memories, was more than just wood and brick, it was a living sanctuary. The very air inside seemed to hum with the echoes of laughter that once ricocheted through its cozy, slightly cluttered rooms, dissolving the abrasive worries of the outside world. This house was the silent, steadfast witness to every tentative first step of their chubby toddler feet, every awkward teenage date that unfolded on my floral sofa, every chaotic holiday dinner where we squeezed together, too many people, always too many, but always, I believed, happy. I didn't merely observe these moments, I invested myself in them, becoming a part of the mortar that held the bricks of their lives together. My hands, now a roadmap of my labors, bear the thin, parchment-like skin, the gnarled blue veins, the dull ache of arthritis. But these hands were once tireless engines of creation. They knitted soft blankets, tended my prized rose garden, a source of quiet pride where each perfect bloom was a small, unfolding secret. And they prepared thousands upon thousands of meals, nourishing not just their bodies, but what I naively believed was the very soul of our family. My eyes, though framed by a delicate web of wrinkles, still held, I thought, that fierce, unwavering love that defined me. I weathered their storms, financial worries, childhood illnesses, marital spats, with a quiet, uncomplaining resilience, always placing their needs before my own. This was never a burden, it was my sacred calling. Or so I thought. But time, that indifferent accountant, always collects its due. The change was insidious, beginning as a low-grade ache, a dull throb in my joints I dismissed as just age. My once energetic pace slowed, weeding the garden became an expedition, climbing stairs a deliberate, breath-catching journey. I was a clock winding down, ticks growing slower, more labored. The moment that cleaved my life into a before and an after was a fall in my beloved garden. Not dramatic, just mundane. My worn gardening clog snagged on an exposed tree root, a brief disorienting sensation of weightlessness, then the hard, unyielding impact. A sickening crack echoed in my hip. The pain was a white-hot, blinding wave. And so, Agnes Mayhew, a woman of constant motion, found herself confined to a wheelchair. My cherished independence was brutally snatched away. This wasn't just a physical blow, it was the first tremor of an earthquake that would soon shatter everything. Little did they know, it would also be the catalyst for my own quiet revolution. The initial outpouring of concern from my children, Sarah, the pragmatic eldest, Robert, the perpetually busy middle, and Benjamin, the youngest, a whirlwind of personal dramas, was a comforting balm. Their faces, arranged in sympathy, surrounded my hospital bed. My 5 grandchildren, bless their fleeting attention spans, sent glittery cards adorned with awkwardly drawn, vibrant flowers. For a few precious weeks, their chatter about school and friends provided a bright contrast to the sterile stillness of my hospital room. I almost forgot the dull ache in my hip, the dead weight of my legs. But then, as the weeks bled into months, the predictable erosion began. The calls thinned, the visits dwindled, the tapestry of their concern began to fray. Sarah, navigating the relentless demands of a high-pressure career and her own growing family, found it progressively harder to make the hour-long trip across town. Her excuses, delivered with weary sighs over the phone, grew more elaborate, each one tinged with a weariness that seemed to blame me for its very existence. "Mom, you just don't understand how busy I am," she'd sigh, as if my immobility somehow made me incapable of comprehending the crushing weight of her schedule. Robert, always adept at evasion, cited nebulous work pressures and sudden, urgent business trips, a narrative brazenly contradicted by the gleaming new luxury SUV I knew was parked in his driveway, purchased, I suspected, with money he'd conveniently forgotten to mention. Benjamin, the most restless and volatile of my children, became an increasingly rare presence, his promises to visit dissolving into the ether like morning fog, replaced by vague, mumbled apologies about stuff going on. The practical burden of my care, initially shared amongst them in a flurry of familial duty and performative concern, was gradually and quietly outsourced. It fell to a rotating roster of part-time aides sourced from a local agency. These young women, mostly in their 20s, preoccupied with the vibrant tapestry of their own lives and perpetually glued to their phone screens, moved through my house with an air of detached professionalism. They seemed more focused on the glowing rectangles in their hands than on the needs of the silent, aging woman in the wheelchair. They performed their duties, the bathing, the dressing, the meal preparation, with a mechanical competence devoid of warmth, of a gentle touch, of a simple kind word that might have eased the suffocating weight of loneliness. My house, once a vessel filled with the exuberant warmth and joyous noise of family, now echoed with a sterile, profound silence, punctuated only by the faint electric whir of my wheelchair and the impersonal canned chatter of daytime television. Loneliness became my constant companion. It wasn't just a feeling, but a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating cloak that settled over my shoulders each morning and grew heavier with each passing, silent day. I would spend hours sitting by the large picture window in the living room, a sentinel watching a world from which I was now excluded, as if I were a forgotten exhibit in a museum of a life once lived. I watched the neighborhood children play outside, their laughter and shouts drifting through the closed glass, stirring a wistful, painful ache in my heart for the days when my own grandchildren had filled my yard with their joyful noise. I saw their faces in those of the playing children, I heard their long-ago laughter, now just a faint, mocking echo in the vast, empty halls of my memory. Oh, the irony. I was living in the very home I'd created for them, and yet I felt like a stranger, an intruder in my own sanctuary. Then came the meeting that would shatter any lingering illusions. One particularly bleak afternoon, as cold spring rain drummed a monotonous, dreary rhythm against my bedroom window, Sarah arrived. Her visit was brief, chillingly businesslike, utterly devoid of genuine affection. She stood at the foot of my bed, not even bothering to take a seat, as if I were merely an agenda item on her schedule, a problem to be solved, a box to be checked. She didn't ask about my health or how I was managing. She went straight to the point, her voice flat, emotionless. She began to speak of the increasing financial burden of my care, the ever-rising bills for the home aides, the logistical difficulties of coordinating their constantly shifting schedules, and the strain it was putting on the family. The words tumbled out in a smooth, rehearsed flow, a performance perfected in a mirror. The implication was clear and sharp as a shard of glass. I was the source of the strain. I was the problem. The words, though cloaked in a thin veneer of feigned concern, felt cold and clinical, stripping away any lingering foolish hope I still harbored for a return to the closeness we once shared. This wasn't a conversation about my feelings or my well-being. It was a financial report, and I, Agnes Mayhew, was the primary liability. Then came the suggestion, the true, insidious purpose of her visit. It was delivered with a practiced reluctance that I saw through instantly, a theatrical sigh preceding the inevitable proposal. She spoke of a wonderful assisted living facility she had supposedly found, her voice adopting a falsely cheerful, saleswoman-like tone as she explained how I would receive round-the-clock professional care and have plenty of opportunities for social interaction. "Mom, it's like a resort," she chirped, her smile tight and strained, a painful caricature of warmth that didn't reach her eyes. "There's bingo. And arts and crafts. You'll make so many new friends." The true meaning of her words hung heavy and suffocating in the air between us, a stench of abandonment. I was becoming too much of a burden, too expensive, too complicated. There was no longer a place for me in the neat, busy architecture of their lives. I was an inconvenient truth, to be tucked away and forgotten. The move was executed with swift, impersonal efficiency. My belongings, the physical artifacts of a life lived over 7 decades, were packed by strangers, young people in uniforms from a moving company who showed no reverence for my memories. They handled my cherished possessions with a careless indifference that felt like a profound violation. My beloved furniture, each piece holding a story, was sold or given away without my input, without a single question directed at me. My hand-knitted shawl, which had always lain on the back of my favorite armchair, my old porcelain tea set, saved for special occasions that had never quite materialized, the framed photographs of my children and grandchildren that had smiled down at me from every surface, all gone. I was simply transported like an inanimate object, a piece of inconvenient luggage, to a sterile, anonymous room in the assisted living facility. The walls were painted a bland, institutional beige, a color devoid of personality or warmth. The floor was scuffed beige linoleum. The single window looked out onto a brick wall and a row of dumpsters. There was no photograph of mine on the wall, no piece of my own embroidery, not even the lingering scent of my roses. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. The cheerful, forced chatter of the other residents in the common areas seemed distant and alien, the sound of another world to which I did not belong. I was alone, truly, profoundly alone in a way I had never before imagined possible. This wasn't just physical solitude, it was an emotional desert. They hadn't just moved me, they had erased me. They thought. Oh, how utterly wrong they were. In the sterile, humming quiet of my new surroundings, a cold, hard seed of resentment began to sprout in the barren soil of my heart. The years of selfless giving, the sacrifices I had made without a second thought, the unconditional love I had poured out like water into a bottomless well, it all seemed to have been forgotten. It had been dismissed as easily and casually as clearing a forgotten dish from the dinner table. It wasn't just neglect, it was an erasure of my value, of my role, of my very identity within the family I had built. This feeling festered, a slow-burning, smokeless fire, growing stronger with each passing, identical day. The deep sadness I had initially felt began to curdle, transforming into something harder, sharper, a burning sense of injustice, a deep, foundational ache of betrayal. The family to which I had dedicated my life had cast me aside, not out of dire necessity or a tragic circumstance, but out of simple, stark convenience. I had ceased to be useful in the accustomed sense, and so I had been discarded. And that, I realized, was their biggest mistake. They had underestimated the quiet woman who knitted blankets and baked cookies. They had no idea the steel that lay beneath the soft exterior. One sleepless night, the 3rd or 4th in a row, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights in the hallway outside my door hummed their monotonous electronic song, their cold, indifferent light seeping through the crack beneath the door, illuminating my thoughts. Lying in that strange, narrow bed, in that strange, empty room, I made a decision. A new clarity, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of my grief. The years of being the selfless matriarch, the ever-giving, ever-forgiving grandma, were over. A new chapter was beginning, one in which I would, for the first time in my life, put myself first. And if that meant a small, quiet reckoning along the way, a carefully orchestrated revelation, then so be it. My heart, once soft and pliable as rising dough, now seemed to have been forged from steel. The next morning, as the first faint gray rays of dawn pierced through the cheap vinyl blinds of my window, I requested a meeting with the facility's administrator. Her name was Mrs. Davis, a kind but clearly overworked woman with weary eyes and a permanently strained smile. I spoke calmly, with a firmness that surprised even myself, inquiring about my legal options and the procedure for updating my last will and testament. Mrs. Davis, accustomed to the endless complaints and meandering requests of the residents, patiently explained the entire process, providing me with the name of a local lawyer who made visits to the facility. I listened intently, my mind already formulating a plan, each step carefully considered, a new and unfamiliar sensation of cold purpose spreading through me, like ice water through my veins. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about absolute, unshakable resolve. A few days later, the lawyer, a Mr. Harrison, arrived. He was a man known for his discretion and meticulous attention to detail, and more importantly, for not asking unnecessary questions. He simply listened, his gaze steady, his silence unnervingly perceptive. I felt, to my own surprise, remarkably confident, a sensation so foreign after months of feeling utterly helpless. My gnarled, arthritic hands rested on the arms of my wheelchair with a surprising steadiness, no tremor betraying the emotional magnitude of my decision. I laid out my wishes to him in a clear, unwavering voice. I wanted to completely rewrite my will. Mr. Harrison listened without judgment, his gold-nibbed pen scratching quietly against the thick paper of his legal pad. He noted my instructions, occasionally asking a clarifying question about legal phrasing, but never attempting to pry into my motives. He seemed to sense a deep-seated, immovable resolve in his elderly client and respected her right to silence. The process took several weeks. It became the new focus of my days. I meticulously reviewed each draft of the document that Mr. Harrison sent over, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with a newfound, intense focus. I made several amendments, each one a small, deliberate step in my evolving plan. With each signature I placed on the preliminary documents, I felt a surge of power, a sense of control returning to me, like a slow tide turning. It was a sensation I had not felt in a very long time, and I found that I liked it very much. Throughout this entire period, my family remained largely absent. Their silence was not just a confirmation of my decision, it was a deafening endorsement. A brief, perfunctory phone call from Robert on my birthday was the only contact I had, a mere formality. He sounded distracted, eager to get off the line, his hollow, rushed well wishes only serving to solidify my resolve. "Hope you're doing well, Mom." "Gotta run, big meeting," he'd blurt, before hanging up. They had no idea. They would learn that Agnes Mayhew was not a person to be so easily dismissed and forgotten. They would learn that beneath the frail, compliant exterior they had so carelessly warehoused, something else entirely, something formidable, could be hidden. Something that would send shockwaves through their comfortable, self-serving lives. Finally, the day came when the new will was finalized. It was signed, witnessed by Mrs. Davis and a nurse, notarized, and now legally binding. I felt a quiet, profound satisfaction, a small but firm surge of control returning to my life. I was once again the master of my own destiny, a sovereign of my own small, quiet kingdom. The contents of the will remained my secret, a document locked away in Mr. Harrison's safe, its potential held in reserve. It was my ace in the hole, an unplayed card that no one else knew I held. And it was loaded. Life in the assisted living facility settled into its predictable, monotonous routine. I participated in the scheduled activities with a placid, compliant demeanor. I sat through the morning chair exercises, the endless, mind-numbing games of bingo where the numbers blurred before my eyes, the afternoon screenings of old black and white movies I had seen 100 times before. I made polite, surface-level conversation with the other residents, women much like myself, forgotten relics of families who had moved on, their eyes holding that same wistful, distant look. I endured the often patronizing cheerfulness of the staff, their smiles and words as mechanical and prepackaged as the bland food they served 3 times a day. But beneath this placid surface, beneath the mask of quiet compliance, a subtle but profound shift had occurred. The former Agnes, the gentle, ever-giving, soft-hearted woman who always put others first, was gone. Her place had been taken by a woman with a core of steel and a carefully guarded secret. I was no longer soft clay to be molded by the hands of others. I was a sculptor, meticulously shaping my own future, and, unbeknownst to them, theirs as well. I began to pay closer attention to my finances. The monthly bank statements and investment portfolio reports, which used to be unceremoniously piled up on my dresser, dismissed as mere paperwork for my meager pension, were now meticulously examined. For decades, I had practiced a quiet, unassuming frugality. While my children saw only a woman who scrimped and saved every penny, relying on coupons and living within strict limits, I had been methodically and intelligently investing. A small inheritance from my own mother in the 1970s, a few well-chosen stocks bought on a whim after overhearing a tip at the hairdresser's, years of diverting tiny, seemingly insignificant amounts from my late husband's modest pension into carefully selected mutual funds. It had all been managed quietly, without fanfare, without anyone ever suspecting. Over 50 years, these small, consistent streams had converged into a substantial river, a veritable ocean. The result was a fortune far greater than my family could have ever imagined. I had always lived simply, my focus on providing for their wants rather than indulging in any luxuries for myself. Every saved penny, every shrewdly purchased stock was a brick in the invisible financial empire I had built. No one, absolutely no one, suspected its existence. The full realization of my own financial independence, confirmed by the stark black and white of the financial statements, brought a quiet, barely perceptible smile to my lips. They thought I was a helpless old woman, a financial drain entirely dependent on their grudging charity. They believed I was just another useless burden to be managed and eventually written off, like an expired medication. In reality, they were the ones who were in for a rude awakening. This knowledge was a warm secret blanket on a cold night, a hidden well of power that sustained me through the bland food and the forced cheer. As the months passed, I began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, widen the distance between myself and my family. When they called, and the calls grew rarer and rarer, dwindling to almost nothing, I did not always return them immediately. My answers to their perfunctory questions about my health became brief and noncommittal. "I'm fine," I'd say, my voice flat, devoid of the warmth they'd grown accustomed to. "Just fine." I offered no explanations for my newfound brevity, no apologies. I simply created a space between us, a quiet, echoing void that mirrored the emotional chasm they had created first. When Sarah complained about being busy, her voice frayed with self-imposed stress, would simply reply, "I understand." My tone was flat, devoid of any trace of sympathy, a subtle echo of her own detachment. "Life gets complicated," I'd add, a seemingly innocuous phrase that, to me, carried a hidden barb. The holidays approached, a time of year that I had once orchestrated with the precision and passion of a symphony conductor. My house had always been the festive heart of the family, filled with the scent of pine needles and gingerbread, the sound of carols and laughter, a beacon of warmth. This year, I made no effort. When Sarah called to inquire about my Christmas plans, a slight annoyance in her voice as she tried to arrange her own impossibly complicated family schedule, I simply stated calmly that I would be staying at the facility. The surprised disappointment in her voice was palpable, almost tangible through the phone line. But I felt nothing. No guilt, no regret, not even a fleeting wisp of sadness. Only emptiness. Only quiet, unshakable resolve. The day of reckoning was drawing nearer, though my family remained blissfully, arrogantly unaware. I continued my quiet routine, a ghost in the machine of the facility, observing, planning, waiting. The secret of my altered will and my substantial fortune was a silent, coiled power I now possessed, a loaded weapon waiting for the opportune moment. I knew the time would come when they would be forced to realize the enormity of their mistake, the profound depth of their callousness. And when that day arrived, Agnes Mayhew would be ready. The long, thankless years of being the unseen, unappreciated cornerstone of their lives were finally over. The game, I knew, was far from over. I awaited the final play with cold, patient calm. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a slow-motion unraveling they'd never see coming. The day I had been waiting for arrived, not with eager anticipation, no, but rather with a sense of inevitability, much like how autumn succeeds summer. This was the day when the final, carefully crafted piece of my plan would fall into place. I knew I would catch them completely off guard. This wasn't a desperate cry for help they ignored, nor tears they failed to wipe away. This was a quiet, methodical strike, a surgical operation of poetic justice, that they never expected from their sweet old grandma. My health, as anticipated, had continued its slow, steady decline. This wasn't a deception, I simply allowed nature to take its course, refusing certain interventions, embracing the passive descent. I spoke less, listened more, my growing silence and apparent frailty only reinforcing their perception of me as a weak, decrepit old woman on the verge of senility. They saw only the fading shell, never noticing the sharp, calculating mind that still worked like a well-oiled machine within. This was my final, most elaborate act of service to them, allowing them to underestimate me, to build their fall on their own arrogance. On one ordinary Thursday, my children were summoned. Sarah, Robert, and even the elusive Benjamin were invited by Mr. Harrison to a very important family meeting regarding my estate. They arrived at the lawyer's downtown office with expressions of mild annoyance, viewing it as another tedious obligation, a waste of their precious, busy time. I imagine they expected another drawn-out discussion about the mounting costs of my care, or perhaps some legal formality related to the future sale of my small house, a property they'd already mentally sold and divided the proceeds of, probably with lavish plans for the cash. They sat in the plush, uncomfortable chairs in the conference room, their faces a mixture of boredom and impatience. Robert checked his watch repeatedly. Benjamin was glued to his phone, a low hum of TikTok videos emanating from his pocket. Sarah meticulously picked at a loose thread on her expensive blazer. Mr. Harrison, as always, was impeccably professional, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to their barely contained restlessness. He spoke in a low, even tone, explaining the procedure for the meeting, setting the stage for what would undoubtedly be the most shocking day of their lives. I sat beside him at the head of the long, polished table, my wheelchair a silent metallic throne. I kept my eyes closed, feigning exhaustion, a tactic I had perfected over the past year. No one paid me much attention, their eyes were fixed on the lawyer, eager for this tiresome obligation to conclude so they could return to their important lives. So, Mr. Harrison began, his voice calm, clear, turning the first page of a thick, bound document before him. As you know, Ms. Agnes Mayhew recently made significant changes to her last will and testament, and in accordance with her instructions, we are gathered today to read it. A slight flicker of surprise, mixed with irritation, crossed my children's faces. Changes? Sarah repeated, her brows slightly furrowed, a hint of genuine confusion in her voice. But Mom never said anything. I thought everything was already set up. Robert looked up from his phone, a frown replacing his usual detached expression. She had every right to do so, Ms. Lewis, Mr. Harrison replied politely, his gaze remaining steady on the document, giving nothing away. And this will, dated 6 months ago, is her final and legally binding testament. Please pay attention. A new tension entered the room, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air. They exchanged uneasy glances. They were beginning to suspect something was amiss, but couldn't quite put their finger on it. He began to read. First came the dry legal formalities, the mundane, expected clauses. He mentioned my modest state pension, a small checking account designated to cover my funeral expenses, details that made them visibly relax, a collective sigh of relief. This was what they expected, the crumbs from their burden of a mother. They were probably already mentally divesting my old tea set, perhaps a small, forgotten antique. Then, Mr. Harrison paused. He looked at them over the top of his reading glasses, his gaze piercing, and I, from behind my closed eyelids, could sense the dramatic shift in the room's atmosphere. I detected a tiny, almost imperceptible glint of satisfaction in his usually calm eyes. This was it. The moment. And now, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more resonant, we move to the main portion of the estate. I, Agnes Mayhew, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath. He began to name assets. He spoke of investment portfolios with established brokerage firms they had never heard of, names that sounded far too grand for their simple, penny-pinching mother. He spoke of stock holdings in major blue-chip companies, names they recognized from the news, companies whose shares they only dreamed of owning. He spoke of municipal bonds and 2 small rental properties in a neighboring state, properties whose existence was a complete secret, never once hinted at. The figures he quoted were staggering, each one building on the last, painting a picture of unimaginable wealth. With each mention of a 6-figure sum, an audible gasp or a sharp intake of breath rippled through the room, each sound quickly suppressed, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. Their faces. Oh, I wish I could have painted them. Even with my eyes closed, I could picture them perfectly, the grotesque dance of greed and shock. Sarah's mouth had fallen slightly open, her usual composure completely shattered, replaced by a gaping astonishment. Robert, I knew, would have turned a blotchy, apoplectic red, his eyes bulging in shock, his expensive watch now seeming utterly trivial. Benjamin, who had been slumping in his chair with boredom, now sat bolt upright, his phone forgotten on his lap, staring blankly ahead, his jaw slack. Millions of dollars. Not hundreds of thousands. Millions. Thus, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice absolutely even, almost a monotone, savoring the moment. The total taxable estate belonging to me, Agnes Mayhew, amounts to $8,743,200.40, $8,743,200.40. The room fell into a deathly, profound silence. It was a silence so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. It was the sound of their shock, their greed, their utter disbelief, a silence punctuated only by their ragged breathing. But, this is impossible. Sarah finally whispered, her voice weak and trembling, a mere thread of sound, barely audible. Mom, she always said she barely made ends meet. She used coupons. She complained about utility bills. Her voice rose, bordering on hysteria. Where did all this come from? Robert just stared, his face a mask of utter bewilderment, as if the lawyer were speaking a foreign language. Indeed, Mr. Harrison said, and this time, I was certain I detected a slight, almost imperceptible smirk, a hint of private amusement in his voice. Ms. Mayhew was always very frugal and remarkably farsighted in her investments. She preferred to maintain her privacy on the matter, a right she was perfectly entitled to. A chilling silence followed, pregnant with their dawning realization. This wasn't just money. It was their money they could have had, if only they'd been less self-absorbed. Then he moved to the core of it, to the very heart of the reason we were all gathered in that room. He turned another page, the rustle of the paper shockingly loud in the silence. According to my will, he continued, his voice clear and resonant, the entire sum of $8,743,200.40, $8,743,200.40, is to be bequeathed to a collection of charitable organizations. Specifically, 50% to a foundation that assists the elderly living in poverty and combating loneliness, and 50% to programs that support young military veterans so that they may never have to experience abandonment after their service. I felt their eyes turn to me. Even with my eyelids shut, I could feel the intense, burning heat of their stares, like a physical force. I pictured their faces, shock turning to confusion, then to dawning, horrified realization, and finally to pure, unadulterated fury. The blood drained from Sarah's face. Robert's eyes bulged, his mouth working silently. Benjamin finally put his phone down, his expression a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Furthermore, Mr. Harrison added, and his voice now held the solemn finality of a judge delivering a sentence, each word a hammer blow, I have left each of you, my children, Sarah, Robert, and Benjamin, the sum of $1, as a token of your being mentioned in the will and to prevent any legal contest. This was my final, most subtle, most painful jab. $1. A single, solitary dollar. A symbolic, stinging slap in the face. It was a monetary valuation of their complete and utter disregard. A perfect, undeniable symbol of their abandonment. The silence that followed this pronouncement was far louder than any scream, far more devastating than any shouted accusation. It was the sound of their worlds collapsing. I knew, in that moment, that they finally understood. They understood what they had lost. They understood that their mother, whom they considered a burden, a drain, a piece of inconvenient luggage, was actually a hidden treasure, a vast fortune they had carelessly, thoughtlessly thrown away. Their faces, I imagined, were now a horrifying kaleidoscope of emotions, a raw, public display of their deepest shames. I opened my eyes. Their faces were indeed contorted masks of rage, resentment, and a raw, gaping sense of betrayal. All the emotions I had silently endured in my bland, beige room, the loneliness, the abandonment, the feeling of erasure, were now reflected back at me from their faces, magnified 1,000-fold. Sarah's eyes were wide and wild, her carefully constructed composure utterly shattered. Robert's face was beet red, his jaw clenched, veins throbbing in his neck. Benjamin, usually so nonchalant, looked utterly devastated, as if someone had just pulled the rug out from under his entire existence. And in that moment, looking at them, truly looking at them for the first time in what felt like years, I felt neither triumph nor schadenfreude. Only a deep, all-encompassing calm. Justice had been served. My revenge was not cruel, it was merely a mirror reflecting their own actions back at them with perfect, crystalline clarity. They had treated me as worthless, and now they felt worthless. I quietly pressed the button on the control stick of my wheelchair. With a soft whir, barely audible in the stunned silence, I began to move away from the table where my children sat, frozen in their shock. They started to speak, to sputter, to protest, but the words caught in their throats, strangled by the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. "Mom, you can't." Sarah finally croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "This is insane. We're your children." Robert slammed his fist on the table, a dull thud. "This is a mistake, Mr. Harrison. A terrible mistake." Benjamin looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and what almost looked like fear. Their eyes, once so indifferent, now filled with a terrible, belated understanding, the understanding of a lost fortune and perhaps, more importantly, a lost mother whom they had so easily, so conveniently written off. I didn't reply. I just kept rolling. I rolled out of the office, leaving them to deal with the agonizing consequences of their own decisions. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, cutting off the sounds of their brewing discontent, their shocked whispers, their inevitable accusations. Outside the lawyer's office, in the grand, marble-floored lobby, the world continued on its axis. People bustled past, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. The sun was shining brightly through the tall windows, casting long, peaceful shadows. And I, Agnes Mayhew, finally felt truly free. My story didn't end as they had written it. It didn't end with me forgotten in a beige room, a burden to be managed. No. It ended on my terms. It ended with justice, peace, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the true value of a person isn't measured in convenience, but in the love and respect they earn. And sometimes, the most profound revenge is simply living a life they thought they'd stolen, but couldn't. My secret wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming my dignity, my autonomy, and my peace. And for that, every single penny, every carefully planned step, was worth it.